If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, survival, and the untamed frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The rain hammered against the wooden shutters of the small homestead like bullets from a Colt revolver. Inside, Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as three men in dark coats loomed over her kitchen table. Thunder crashed overhead, illuminating their hard faces through the flickering candlelight that danced across the room. "Mrs. Sullivan, you've got until morning to pack your things and get out," growled the tallest man, his badge catching the light. Sheriff Hawkins had been bought and paid for by the railroad company, and everyone in Cedar Creek knew it. His cold eyes showed no mercy for the widow who sat before him, trembling not from fear, but from righteous anger. "This land has been in my family for 20 years, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "My husband died defending it from raiders, and I'll not be moved by the likes of you and your railroad masters." She stood up slowly, her green eyes blazing with defiance that had been forged in the harsh crucible of frontier life. The second man, dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the humble cabin, stepped forward with a sneer. "The railroad needs this land for the new track to Denver, ma'am. We've made you a generous offer, more than this patch of dirt is worth. Take it, or we'll take the land anyway." His manicured hand smoothed his vest as he spoke. "I told you before, Mr. Pemberton, and I'll tell you again," Margaret replied, her chin raised high. "This land is not for sale. My husband's grave is on that hill, and I'll not see it desecrated by your iron horses." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows like the ghosts of all those who had died to build this territory from nothing but wilderness. Sheriff Hawkins placed his hand on his gun belt, the leather creaking ominously in the small room. "Ma'am, you're making this harder than it needs to be. The law says we can take this land for the public good. You've got no choice in the matter." His voice carried the weight of corrupt authority, backed by men who cared nothing for justice or decency. The third man, younger than the others but with eyes just as cold, pulled out a rolled document from his coat. "We've got the eviction papers right here, signed by Judge Morrison. You leave tonight or we'll drag you out come morning." The parchment crackled as he unrolled it, the official seals and stamps meaning nothing to Margaret's heart. Outside, the storm grew more violent, as if nature itself was protesting the injustice taking place in the small cabin. Lightning split the sky, casting eerie shadows on the walls where Margaret's few precious possessions hung. A photograph of her late husband in his Union Army uniform, her mother's quilting needles, and a small wooden cross carved by her father's own hands. "You men have no souls," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying the pain of loss and the fury of injustice. "You come into my home on a night like this, threatening a woman who's lost everything to this harsh land except her dignity. You should be ashamed of yourselves." Her words cut through the room like a knife through leather. Pemberton laughed, a sound as cold as winter wind across the prairie. "Dignity doesn't build railroads, Mrs. Sullivan. Progress waits for no one, especially not for stubborn widows who don't know their place." He gestured toward the door with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if brushing away an annoying insect. "Pack your things," Sheriff Hawkins ordered, his patience clearly at an end. "You've got 1 hour. After that, we're coming back with more men, and we won't be asking nicely." The three men moved toward the door, their boots echoing heavily on the wooden floor that Margaret's husband had laid with his own 2 hands. As the door slammed shut behind them, Margaret sank into her chair, the weight of her situation crushing down upon her like a landslide. The rain continued its relentless assault on the roof, each drop like a tear from heaven itself. She looked around the small cabin that had been her home, her sanctuary, her prison, and now her battleground. With trembling hands, she began to gather her few belongings: a change of clothes, her husband's Bible, the daguerreotype of their wedding day, and a small pouch containing the last of her savings. Everything else would have to stay behind, abandoned to the greed of men who measured worth only in dollars and cents, never in memories or love. The hour passed like a lifetime, each minute stretching into eternity as Margaret said goodbye to the only home she had ever known as a married woman. She touched the doorframe where her husband had carved their initials, ran her fingers along the mantel where their wedding portrait had sat, and whispered a prayer for strength to face whatever lay ahead. When the men returned, they brought with them a wagon and 2 more hired hands, rough men with the look of those who would do anything for the right price. The rain had not lessened, and Margaret stepped out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small bundle of possessions clutched tightly to her chest. "Where am I supposed to go on a night like this?" she asked, raising her voice above the howling wind. Water ran down her face, mixing tears with raindrops as she stood in the mud outside her former home. The men on horseback looked down at her with expressions ranging from indifference to outright cruelty. "That's not our problem, Ma'am," Sheriff Hawkins replied, pulling his hat down lower to shield his face from the rain. "You should have taken the railroad's offer when you had the chance. Now you've got nothing but what you can carry." His horse stamped impatiently in the mud, eager to return to warm, dry shelter. Pemberton leaned forward in his saddle, his expensive coat already darkening with moisture. "There's a boarding house in town, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm sure they'll take you in, assuming you've got the money to pay for it." His smile was cruel, knowing full well that Margaret had little money and even less hope of finding decent lodging on such a night. With nowhere else to go, Margaret began walking toward the main road, her boots sinking into the muddy ground with each step. Behind her, she could hear the men breaking down her door, already beginning the process of claiming her land for the railroad. The sound of splintering wood cut through her heart like a blade. The wind whipped her wet skirts around her legs as she struggled down the rutted path that led to the main road. Cedar Creek was 5 miles away, a long walk in good weather, but potentially deadly in a storm like this. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark flashes, showing her a world transformed into something alien and hostile. As she walked, Margaret thought of her husband Thomas, killed 3 years ago when a band of outlaws had tried to steal their cattle. He had fought them off, saving their meager herd, but had taken a bullet in the chest that slowly bled the life out of him over the course of 2 agonizing days. His last words had been a promise that he would watch over her always. The road was a river of mud, and more than once Margaret stumbled and nearly fell. Her bundle of possessions grew heavier with each step, waterlogged and cumbersome. The cold rain soaked through her shawl and dress, chilling her to the bone and making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She had never felt so alone in all her 32 years. Hours passed as she struggled through the storm, and Margaret began to wonder if she would survive the night. Her strength was fading, and hypothermia was setting in as the cold rain continued its merciless assault. Each step became harder than the last, and she found herself stumbling more frequently as exhaustion took its toll on her body. Just when she thought she might collapse on the muddy road and never rise again, Margaret saw a faint light flickering through the trees ahead. It was too far from the main road to be another homestead, and too small to be the town. As she drew closer, she could make out the shape of a modest cabin tucked back among the pine trees, smoke rising from its chimney despite the rain. The cabin was surrounded by neat stacks of firewood, evidence of its owner's profession and preparedness for harsh weather. A single window glowed with warm yellow light, and Margaret could see the silhouette of a man moving inside. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, uncertain whether to approach or continue on toward town. Another flash of lightning illuminated the scene more clearly, and Margaret could see that the cabin was well maintained despite its remote location. A small garden plot was visible behind the building, and several axes were embedded in a large chopping block near the wood piles. This was clearly the home of a woodsman, someone who made his living from the forest. Desperation finally overcame her hesitation, and Margaret stumbled toward the cabin door. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion and cold, and she could barely lift her hand to knock. When she finally managed to rap her knuckles against the wooden door, the sound was so weak that she wondered if anyone inside would even hear it above the storm. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a tall, bearded man with kind eyes and work-hardened hands. He was dressed in simple clothes, wool pants and a flannel shirt, but there was something about his presence that immediately made Margaret feel safer than she had in hours. Behind him, she could see the warm glow of a fireplace and smell coffee brewing. "Ma'am, what in God's name are you doing out in this storm?" the man asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. Without waiting for an answer, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. "Please, get inside before you catch your death. You're soaked through to the skin." His accent carried the soft drawl of someone from further south. Margaret stumbled across the threshold, her wet boots squelching on the wooden floor. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force, and she began shivering even more violently as her body tried to adjust to the sudden change in temperature. "I'm sorry to trouble you, sir. I had nowhere else to go." Her voice was barely above a whisper. The woodsman quickly closed the door behind her and guided her to a chair near the fireplace. "No trouble at all, ma'am. My name is Jacob Morrison, and any decent person would do the same." He moved with surprising gentleness for such a large man, fetching a thick blanket from a chest and wrapping it around her shoulders with careful respect for her modesty. "I'm Margaret Sullivan," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "I was turned out of my home tonight by the railroad men. They want my land for their new track to Denver." The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly might somehow make them less real, less painful to speak aloud. Jacob's expression darkened at her words, and he poured her a cup of hot coffee from the pot that had been warming by the fire. "Those railroad men have been causing trouble all up and down this valley. They think they can just take whatever they want because they've got money and corrupt officials on their side." He handed her the steaming mug with both hands. Margaret wrapped her numb fingers around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her bones. "They gave me 1 hour to pack and leave. Sheriff Hawkins said he had eviction papers signed by Judge Morrison." She looked up at Jacob with surprise as she realized what she had just said. "Morrison? Are you related to the judge?" Jacob's jaw tightened, and he looked away toward the fire. "Judge Morrison is my older brother, ma'am. We haven't spoken in 5 years, not since he started taking money from the railroad company. He's forgotten what it means to stand up for what's right." The pain in his voice was evident, the wound of family betrayal still fresh after all this time. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." She sipped the coffee, feeling its warmth spread through her chest and begin to chase away the bone-deep chill that had settled into her body. The simple kindness of this stranger was more comfort than she had received in months. Jacob shook his head and turned back to her with a sad smile. "It's not your fault, Mrs. Sullivan. My brother made his choices and I've made mine. I chose to live honestly, even if it means living alone." He gestured around the modest but comfortable cabin, clearly the home of a man who had found peace in solitude and simple work. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, Margaret felt safer than she had since her husband's death. Jacob moved around the small space with quiet efficiency, preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread while she warmed herself by the fire. He didn't press her for details about her situation, seeming to understand that she needed time to process what had happened. As the evening wore on, Margaret found herself telling Jacob about her life, how she and Thomas had met in Kansas and traveled west together to build a new life, how they had struggled through drought and disease and raiders to keep their small homestead going, and how she had managed to survive alone for 3 years after his death. Jacob listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that showed he understood the hardships of frontier life. He'd been living alone in the mountains for 8 years, he told her, ever since his wife died in childbirth, along with their unborn son. He had found solace in the honest work of cutting timber and the quiet companionship of the forest. "What will you do now?" Jacob asked as the fire began to burn lower. Outside, the storm seemed to be finally weakening, though rain still pattered steadily against the windows. Margaret realized that morning would come soon, and with it, the harsh reality of her situation. She had no home, little money, and few prospects for supporting herself. "I don't know," Margaret admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion and uncertainty. "I suppose I'll try to find work in town, maybe as a seamstress or taking in laundry. It won't be much of a life, but it's better than starving." She tried to keep the despair out of her voice, but Jacob's keen eyes saw right through her brave facade. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying flames as if seeking guidance from the dancing light. When he finally spoke, his words surprised Margaret more than anything else that had happened on this strange, terrible night. "Mrs. Sullivan, I have a proposition for you, if you'll hear it. It's not what you might expect." Margaret looked up at him, curiosity overcoming her weariness. There was something in his tone that suggested he had been thinking about this carefully, weighing his words before speaking them aloud. "I'm listening, Mr. Morrison. After tonight, I think I'm ready to consider almost any honest proposal." She managed a weak smile despite her circumstances. "I need help around here," Jacob said slowly, choosing his words with care. "The garden needs tending, and I'm not much good with a needle and thread. My clothes are falling apart, and I eat beans and cornbread most every meal because I never learned to cook properly. You need a safe place to stay and honest work to support yourself." Margaret felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she wasn't sure if it was hope or fear that quickened her pulse. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morrison?" she asked carefully. She had learned to be cautious about the motives of men, especially in her vulnerable position as a widow with no family to protect her. Jacob looked directly into her eyes, his expression sincere and respectful. "I'm proposing a business arrangement, ma'am, nothing improper or unseemly. You would have your own room, your privacy, and your dignity. In exchange for help with cooking, mending, and keeping house, I would provide you with food, shelter, and protection from those who might try to take advantage of you." The offer was more generous than Margaret had dared to hope for, but she had learned to be wary of arrangements that seemed too good to be true. "And what would people say about a widow woman living alone with a bachelor man? My reputation is about all I have left, Mr. Morrison. I can't afford to lose that too." Her voice carried the weight of social expectations and moral concerns. "People will say what they always say," Jacob replied with a shrug, "but anyone who knows me knows I'm an honorable man. We would conduct ourselves with proper respect at all times. If it would make you more comfortable, we could ask Reverend Thompson to come out once a week to check on things and vouch for our conduct." Margaret considered his offer carefully, weighing her limited options against the risks and benefits of his proposal. She could try to make her own way in town, working for pennies and living in whatever squalid conditions she could afford, or she could accept this stranger's kindness and try to build a new kind of life in the mountains. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked finally. "You don't even know me. I could be lazy or mean-tempered or dishonest. Why take such a risk on a stranger?" Now, there had to be some catch, some hidden motive that he wasn't revealing. In her experience, men rarely did anything for women without expecting something in return. Jacob smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him all evening. "Mrs. Sullivan, any woman who stood up to Sheriff Hawkins and the railroad men the way you did tonight is not lazy or mean-tempered. As for honesty, well, I reckon a dishonest person would have taken the railroad's money and run. You chose to fight for what was yours, even when it cost you everything. His words touched something deep in Margaret's heart, a spark of the self-respect that she had thought was lost forever when the men forced her from her home. "You really think I did the right thing?" she asked quietly. "Even though it left me with nothing?" The doubt in her voice revealed how much the night's events had shaken her confidence. "I think you did the only thing a person of character could do," Jacob replied firmly. "Money can't buy back your self-respect, but losing your self-respect for money leaves you poor in ways that matter more than coins in your pocket. Your husband would have been proud of the stand you took tonight." His words carried the weight of conviction and experience. Tears began to flow down Margaret's cheeks, the first she had allowed herself since the ordeal began. They were not tears of sadness or defeat, but of relief and gratitude for this unexpected kindness from a stranger who understood the value of doing what was right, even when it came at great personal cost. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jacob reached over and gently squeezed her hand, the gesture both comforting and respectful. "So, Mrs. Sullivan, what do you say? Will you consider my offer? We can try it for a month, and if it doesn't work out for either of us, I'll help you get settled in town with enough money to get started on your own." His proposal was fair and reasonable, with no pressure or coercion. Margaret looked around the comfortable cabin, at the warm fire, and the simple furniture crafted with obvious skill and care. She thought about the alternative, a cold, uncertain future in a town where she knew few people and had fewer prospects. The choice, when she really considered it, was not difficult to make. "Yes, Mr. Morrison, I accept your offer." Relief washed over Jacob's face, though he tried to hide it. "Good. That's settled then. You can take the back room. It's small, but it has a good bed and a window that looks out over the valley. I'll sleep out here by the fire tonight and start building you a proper privacy screen tomorrow." He was already making plans, thinking ahead to how they could make the arrangement work. As Margaret settled into the small back room, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. This morning, she had been a woman clinging desperately to the past, fighting a losing battle against forces too powerful for her to resist. Tonight, she was beginning to see the possibility of a different kind of future, one built on mutual respect and honest work, rather than the bitter memories of loss. Outside, the storm finally began to subside, the rain gentling to a soft patter and the wind dying down to a whisper through the pine trees. Inside the cabin, two souls who had been battered by life's cruelties found unexpected comfort in each other's company. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of Jacob banking the fire for the night, his movements quiet and respectful. As the weeks passed, the people of Cedar Creek began to hear about the arrangement between the widow Sullivan and the hermit woodsman Morrison. Most were respectful, recognizing it as a practical solution to both parties' needs. A few busybodies whispered, but Reverend Thompson's weekly visits and his public praise for their proper conduct quickly silenced most criticism. Margaret found herself feeling more alive than she had in years. The mountain air and healthy food improved her health, while the sense of purpose and security allowed her natural spirits to begin recovering from the grief and fear that had dominated her life for so long. She discovered talents she hadn't known she possessed, like identifying edible plants and preserving food for the winter. Jacob, meanwhile, found his own life enriched by Margaret's presence in ways he hadn't expected. The cabin felt like a home again, instead of just a shelter. Margaret's intelligence and strength reminded him that he had isolated himself not from wisdom, but from loneliness and fear. Her courage in facing the railroad men inspired him to think about his own relationship with his brother. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Jacob brought up a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what happened with the railroad and my brother's part in it. I wonder if I shouldn't try to talk to him, see if there's anything to be done about getting your land back." Margaret looked at him with surprise. She had mentioned the land only a few times since that first night, and she had assumed it was lost forever. "Jacob, that's kind of you to think of, but I don't see how anything can be changed now. The railroad has taken possession, and they have the legal papers. Your brother signed them himself." She tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice. "Legal and right aren't always the same thing," Jacob replied thoughtfully. "My brother used to understand that difference before the railroad money started flowing into his pockets. Maybe if I could get him to remember who he used to be, he might be willing to take another look at what he's done." There was hope in his voice, but also uncertainty about whether he could reach the brother he had once known. Margaret reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become natural between them over the months of shared hardship and mutual support. "I don't want you to damage your relationship with your family on my account, Jacob. What's done is done. I have a good life here with you. I don't need anything more." Her words were sincere, but Jacob could see the wistful look in her eyes when she spoke of her lost home. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to try," Jacob said quietly. "Because you're not asking for it. Because you found peace with what happened. That kind of acceptance makes your case stronger, not weaker. It shows that this isn't about revenge or greed, but about justice." He squeezed her hand gently, drawing strength from her calm wisdom. The next morning, Jacob put on his best clothes and rode to town to visit his brother for the first time in 5 years. Judge Morrison's house was one of the finest in Cedar Creek, built with railroad money and furnished with expensive pieces shipped from back east. The contrast with Jacob's simple cabin was stark and telling, representing the different choices the brothers had made. Judge Morrison was surprised to see Jacob at his door, but he invited him in with the cautious courtesy of a man who knew he had reason to feel guilty. The brothers sat in the judge's ornate parlor, the distance between them measured not just in years, but in the choices that had driven them apart. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with unspoken recriminations and regret. "I heard you've been harboring that Sullivan woman," the judge said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "People in town are talking about it." He was clearly uncomfortable with the subject, perhaps because it reminded him of his role in Margaret's displacement, but he felt compelled to address it as both brother and civil authority. "Margaret Sullivan is a fine woman who was wronged by the railroad and by those who were supposed to protect her," Jacob replied firmly. "She deserved better than being thrown out of her home on a stormy night because greedy men wanted her land." There was no accusation in his voice, but the implication was clear enough that both men understood what he was really saying. Judge Morrison looked away, his face flushing with either anger or shame. "The law is the law, Jacob. I can't make exceptions just because I feel sorry for someone. The railroad has the right of eminent domain. They needed that land for the public good." His words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, rehearsed justifications for actions he knew were questionable. "The public good?" Jacob asked quietly. "Or the good of the men who are lining your pockets with gold, Samuel? When did you stop caring about real justice and start caring only about the kind of justice that pays well?" He used his brother's first name deliberately, trying to reach the man Samuel had been before corruption had taken hold of him. The judge stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under, Jacob. The territory needs that railroad if we're going to grow and prosper. Sometimes hard decisions have to be made for the greater good. I can't worry about every individual who gets in the way of progress." His voice rose with each word, revealing the internal conflict he had been suppressing. "And what about the individual sitting in your parlor right now?" Jacob asked, standing to face his brother. "What about the boy I used to fish with down at Miller's Creek? What about the man who used to believe that the law was supposed to protect people, not exploit them? What happened to that person, Samuel?" There was pain in his voice, the grief of watching someone he loved become someone he could barely recognize. Judge Morrison sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than his 53 years. The weight of his compromises seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden, and for a moment Jacob could see the brother he remembered beneath the expensive clothes and the guilty defensiveness. That person was naive, Jacob. He believed in fairy tales about justice and right and wrong. Or maybe, Jacob said gently, that person was who you really are, and this man sitting here now is the fairy tale. Maybe it's not too late to remember who you used to be. He sat back down, leaning forward to close the physical and emotional distance between them. Help me help Margaret Sullivan, Samuel. Find a way to give her back what was taken from her. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an expensive clock on the mantel, each second marking the passage of time while Samuel Morrison wrestled with his conscience. Outside, the sounds of the bustling town continued, but inside the parlor, two brothers faced the consequences of the paths they had chosen and the possibility of redemption. Even if I wanted to help, the judge said finally, I'm not sure anything can be done now. The railroad has already begun surveying the land. They've invested considerable money in the project. The territorial governor himself has endorsed it. My hands are tied by forces bigger than both of us. His words carried the weariness of a man who felt trapped by his own choices. Jacob leaned back in his chair, considering his brother's words carefully. Samuel, you're the judge. You have more power than you think you do. If the eviction was handled improperly, if Margaret Sullivan's rights weren't fully protected, couldn't you order a review of the case? Couldn't you at least make sure she received fair compensation for her loss? The suggestion hung in the air between them, a possible bridge across the chasm that had separated the brothers for 5 years. Samuel Morrison stared out the window at the bustling town that the railroad money had helped to build, weighing the cost of doing what was right against the price of admitting he had been wrong. The silence stretched on until Jacob began to wonder if his brother had heard him at all. There might be something, Samuel said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. The railroad's eviction papers were filed hastily. They may not have followed all the proper procedures for notifying Mrs. Sullivan of her rights. If I were to review the case and find procedural errors... He trailed off, the implications of his words clear to both men. Jacob felt a surge of hope, tempered by caution. You would do that? You would risk your relationship with the railroad to help Margaret? He had dreamed of this moment for years, when his brother might choose justice over convenience, but now that it seemed possible, he could hardly believe it was real. What changed your mind, Samuel? Judge Morrison turned back to face his younger brother, and Jacob was surprised to see tears in the older man's eyes. You did, Jacob. Seeing you again, remembering who we used to be before all this started. I've been living with guilt for years, telling myself that I was doing what had to be done. But watching you choose honor over money, simplicity over comfort. He paused, struggling with emotions he had suppressed for too long. I want to be proud of myself again, Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. I want to be the kind of man our father raised me to be, the kind of man you've remained despite everything. If helping Margaret Sullivan is a step toward becoming that person again, then yes, I'll do it. I'll review the case and see what can be done. Jacob stood and extended his hand to his brother, and after a moment's hesitation, Samuel took it. The handshake was firm and warm, carrying years of separation and the hope of reconciliation. Thank you, Samuel. This means more than you know, not just to Margaret, but to me. I've missed having a brother I could respect. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine forgiveness. I've missed being worthy of that respect, Samuel replied. It may take time to undo all the damage I've done, but I'm willing to try. Will you tell Mrs. Sullivan that I'll be reviewing her case? And Jacob, will you consider coming to dinner on Sunday? Martha would love to see you again, and the children barely remember their uncle. The reconciliation between the Morrison brothers became the foundation for Margaret's eventual triumph over the railroad's greed. Judge Morrison's review of the eviction papers revealed numerous procedural violations, and he ordered Margaret's land returned to her with full compensation for her losses. The railroad company fought the decision, but public opinion had turned against them, and they eventually settled rather than face further legal challenges. Margaret faced a difficult choice when her land was restored. She could return to her old homestead and the memories it held, or she could remain in the mountains with Jacob, building a new life from the ashes of the old. The decision was made easier by the changes that had taken place in both of their hearts over the months they had shared hardship and found comfort in each other's company. On a crisp autumn morning, as the aspen leaves turned gold against the deep green of the pines, Margaret and Jacob were married in a simple ceremony at the mountain cabin. Reverend Thompson performed the service, with Judge Morrison and his family as witnesses. The wedding was nothing like the elaborate affair Margaret had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was perfect in its honesty and simplicity. They chose to live on Margaret's reclaimed land, but they also kept the mountain cabin as a retreat where they could escape the pressures of the outside world. Jacob continued his work as a woodsman, while Margaret established a small school for the children of homesteaders who lived too far from town to attend regular classes. Together, they built a life based on mutual respect, shared values, and the hard-won knowledge that true wealth comes from integrity, not gold. The railroad eventually built its line to Denver, but it followed a different route that didn't require the displacement of honest settlers. Judge Morrison's newfound commitment to justice inspired other officials to resist the company's more egregious demands, and the balance of power in the territory began to shift back toward the people who worked the land rather than those who merely sought to exploit it. Years later, when Margaret and Jacob were old and silver-haired, they would sit on their porch in the evenings and watch the trains pass in the distance, carrying passengers and freight toward their destinations in the growing cities of the West. The sight no longer filled Margaret with bitterness, for she had learned that some storms, no matter how fierce, can wash away the old world only to reveal a better one underneath. What do you think was the most important moment in Margaret's journey? Was it when she stood up to the railroad men, when Jacob offered her shelter, or when Judge Morrison chose justice over money? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know which moment from this tale of courage and redemption resonated most strongly with you.